for joining today. And I want to say thank you very much to Nathen Harvey for joining for this fireside chat. I'm going to hand it over to you, Nathen, to give a brief intro and bio, and then we'll jump into it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Jerry. I'm really excited to be here. And it was really a pleasure working together with you on this year's report. So, hi, everyone. My name is Nathen Harvey. I lead up a team at Google Cloud. The team is called DORA. Maybe you've heard of DORA, maybe not, but don't worry. We're going to cover exactly what DORA is over the course of the next few minutes here. And like I said, I'm really excited to be here and talk about how DevOps has evolved and this idea of industrial DevOps. And there's some really fascinating sort of circular moments here, I think, as we talk about that history and what we're all learning together as an industry and as a community.
I'm glad you started with that, Nathen. So one of the things that I've been talking about in presentations and trying to think more deeply on is where DevOps started and that evolution timeline. So that was the first thing I wanted to jump in with you. Where did DevOps start and how did it grow so fast and so furious across the industry?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think to think about where DevOps started, we have to go back to the early 2000s. And as the cloud was starting to emerge and people were really starting to think about how to use technology, not necessarily as just a back-end system, but as a way to drive businesses forward, like moving technology to the forefront of the business. And in that time, there was a lot of anxiety and pressure around exactly how we were building and delivering software. And in fact, at this time, the agile movement around software development was certainly well underway. And we were putting a lot of emphasis on helping developers build things much faster. The challenge was that as developers were building things faster, there wasn't a good sort of discipline and collaboration with getting those things that they built shipped and out into the hands of customers. In fact, in those early days, we often talked about this wall of confusion where developers would write some code and throw it over that wall of confusion to operators who then had to take that code and put it into production and deploy it and then run those systems as they were going. But around 2009, John Allspaw and Paul Hammond gave a talk at the Velocity Conf called 10 Deploys a Day at Flickr. So they were talking about at scale, shipping code to production 10 times a day. People in the audience were flabbergasted. As the story goes, there was fainting in the aisles at this conference. It's completely unheard of that you could ship software that fast. But of course, they were doing that. And the way that they were able to do that is they had this good recognition that the job of operations and the job of development is to move the business forward. And the way that you move the business forward is through collaboration and through culture and through tools, changing out the people and the process and really improving that. And they went and aligned their incentives so that they were all really working towards that same goal. So over time, DevOps, of course, has grown and mutated, and it's become this big community and this practice and really almost a philosophy. So starting in 2009 with that first talk at Velocity Conf, later that year, you had the very first DevOps Days conference, which was founded by Patrick Dubois. That DevOps Days conference was probably the first time the term DevOps came into existence. Moving on from there, though, you had folks at Puppet Labs who were doing some research around the industry, and they published in 2013 the very first State of DevOps report. Now, that has grown over time and become part of what we call DORA, which stands for DevOps Research and Assessment. And I'm happy to say that this year we'll be publishing our 10th DORA report that's coming out in just about a month.
That's exciting. So just unpacking some of that. The 10 deploys a day from Flickr, I'm absolutely fascinated by and just digging into DevOps and learning the history. I couldn't totally wrap my head around it because I don't work in IT. And I've read The Goal and then I read the Phoenix Project shortly thereafter. And it helped me contextualize so much so coming from manufacturing background of thinking about the theory of constraints, identifying the bottlenecks, and getting everybody to operate to maximize that bottleneck for everything it's worth, by figuring out how to make efficiencies before it so that everything can pass through it. And in the goal, it didn't say it, but it talked about that wall of confusion that you mentioned. And then in the Phoenix project, I had no idea that it was a similar, like, fictional story base story. And it was so cool to hear that different perspective in the IT world, taking the manufacturing learnings, adapting them, and then scaling them. Like,
Yeah.
not being so ambitious to say, oh, we're not going to do a percent increase. We're not even going to do a 50% increase. We're doing 10 deploys a day. We're doing like 1,000-fold amplification. I know you're familiar with those books. You just spoke at a conference with Gene Kim, the author of the Phoenix Project.
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about that manufacturing history into IT, what you're familiar with, and in that exponential growth and how people reacted to it a little more, besides the fainting in the aisles?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, I don't have an industrial background myself. I'm definitely a technologist, and I came out of that space. But I mentioned that DevOps kind of followed Agile, and basically we took a lot of lessons from Agile software development practices, and we started applying those to the infrastructure that we run within technology and the operations that we have within technology. But it wasn't just Agile that we learned from. DevOps certainly owes a huge debt of gratitude to things like the Toyota production system and lean manufacturing. We've taken those ideas and applied them to the development of software. And just like you said, like looking for those constraints and how do we alleviate those constraints or maximize them so that we can get the most flow out of the system. And speaking of system, like stepping back and using systems thinking, trying to look at the whole thing and not trying to just do that local optimization, which doesn't necessarily help and potentially even harms the greater good of the system. So I think that that's really, really important and how these things tie back together. And it's really fascinating to me that, we look at the state of industrial DevOps, and it's like we learned from you, and then that the industrial organizations are now starting to learn from the software organizations. And to me, that's the really sort of virtuous cycle, is that we're continuing to learn and grow together as industries. And a lot of times people have tried to take that industrial mindset or that manufacturing mindset and applied it to software. In fact, you hear about software factories, right? This is the factory floor where all of the features get built. Unfortunately, that model, like it is informative, but it falls apart pretty quickly because there in software, we're really concerned with understanding our users. That's not to say that you aren't concerned with that in manufacturing. Of course you are, but maybe there's a little bit more nimble characteristics of software development, and we're able to get much closer to our customers. And unlike in manufacturing, software is a very creative act, right? And we're not trying to pump out thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of the same identical thing. Every time we make a change to our code, it's essentially it's an experiment. And so we look for things like, how do we get fast feedback on the experiments that we're making? How do we invalidate those experiments before we hand them to users, right? And I'm sure that all of that applies to manufacturing, but it's just a slightly different skew or view of that work.
Totally. Yeah. And I was at a conference yesterday and they touched on a couple of those things. So one, yeah, a lot of manufacturing, you have that at scale production, but the conference I was at was automotive. And
Mhm.
we've seen the last probably 10 years, so many headlines about how software is eating the car. And the more conferences I go to, the more people I talk to within the community, they're talking about not saying it, but how software is eating the manufacturing process. We have all this conversation about digital transformation, industrial transformation, Industry 4.0, Industry 5.0. I'll just say metaverse because why not get jargony? There's so many terms that people are trying to digest and figure out how it fits in even like a metal stamping facility where they're using machines from World War II. And they're bringing in IoT devices to get a better understanding of how those things work. And as they bring in more and more devices, whether it's that metal stamping facility or a fully or almost autonomous car making manufacturing plant, there's so much industrial code going in there that slowly but surely I'm seeing more people look to DevOps and look to find this better way. And over the last couple of years, I am going somewhere with this. I've seen more and more people talking about culture. And I had an amazing presentation yesterday from a tier one auto supplier. And while I've been at a lot of technical presentations lately, they talked so much about culture and how if you want anyone to be bought in to this technical transformation, this digital transformation, the people are the center of it. And that's one of the things that I always feel when talking about DevOps, when talking about industrial DevOps. And I wanted to hear your reaction to that because we've talked about culture a lot.
Oh yeah, culture is absolutely key, and in the research that DORA has done over the more than a decade now, we found that culture is kind of the number one predictor of a bunch of different things. First, your ability to deliver software safely and quickly, but also things like security practices. It was in 2021 that or sorry, 2022 that we dug deeply into security practices within the software development lifecycle, and we found the number one predictor of better security practices to be culture, not a specific tool or a specific process, but rather culture. But when we talk about culture, culture is it's kind of a weird thing. It's squishy, right? It's malleable and it's always changing, and it's hard, you can't like point at it and say, oh, there's the culture. Like this, in the same way that you can like, I don't know, point at a widget on the shop floor and say, there's the widget. So what is culture? When we look at culture, we look at things like we actually lean on research from a sociologist named Dr. Ron Westrom. He's done a ton of research into safety critical organizations, think nuclear power plants, emergency rooms, healthcare facilities, and so forth. And one of the things that he observed as he did all of his research in these areas was that the way that information flows through an organization is a really strong indicator of what their culture is like. And in particular, you can also think about things like what happens when a failure happens, because it doesn't matter what industry you're in or what organization you're in, something has gone wrong. In fact, something might be going wrong right now. So how does the organization, how does the team respond? And when Westrom looked at it, he found kind of three typical response types. One, which we'll call the sort of pathological response type, is, man, you messed up. This is a problem. You're going to have to pay for this. And we kind of we shame and we punish the people that identify the failure or that talk about the failure. We look to point fingers, and whatever it is, if there was a failure, it wasn't my fault. It was someone else's fault, right? We're doing this finger pointing.
Mm-hmm.
In the other organizational type, the bureaucratic organizational type, they really look for justice. Oh, something went wrong. Someone must be fired. We have to get rid of that person. The challenge with doing that, when you fire someone after a mistake, anything that they learned goes out the door with them. And we all have to know that they didn't, unless it was a malicious thing, right? We wouldn't call it a mistake. So if it was a mistake, like the person did the best that they could with the knowledge that they had, and they didn't expect this negative outcome. And then the third type of organization that Westrom identified was the generative organization that's really performance oriented. And here, when there's a failure, as an organization, we try to learn as much as we can from that failure. And I think that that's really one of the key things is how we respond to failures and when things go wrong. If we are truly a learning organization, we can take that failure as an opportunity to learn. And hopefully, we're reducing the risk of any failure. This is where, in the software world, we get back to this idea of smaller changes and less work in process. So that if I ship a small change, the chances of it going wrong maybe are similar, but the impact that small change might have is much smaller than a big change might have. And so we can recover faster, we can learn quickly, we can get that feedback and so forth. But that culture really just becomes a big part of it. Culture, of course, goes more than just how you respond to failure and how information flows. It's also, are you able to show up to work as who you are? Are our
Mhm.
teams working well together? Are we distributing work evenly? Many, many different facets that really make up your culture.
Yeah, just that psychologically safe space is what I hear like the most
Absolutely.
out of everything you said in those highly producing, productive organizations. People feel safe to be themselves. They feel safe to speak up when they see something wrong.
Absolutely.
Yesterday, we talked a bunch about IT/OT convergence, and there is that wall in a lot of organizations between IT and OT, and that push of it's not my job. Uh, I'm not responsible for that. That's your problem. How how do we move away from that? Like, what's a good starting point? Because I know you can't overnight go from that blame type place to
Right.
blameless postmortems.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think the good starting point, frankly, and it's gonna sound a little bit too easy to be true, is maybe go to coffee together. You get someone from IT and OT to go to coffee together and get to know each other first as people and understand sort of what keeps you up at night, what are the challenges that you're working on, and then really understand that what we're here to do is work together towards the same goals. Early in my software career, I worked with a manufacturing company. They were responsible for manufacturing breakfast cereal. And so we talked to two different personas, two different people in that organization. The first was the inventory manager. We said, "Hey, what are your incentives like? How do you get a bonus? What gets you promoted?" And the inventory manager said, "It's easy. It's just-in-time delivery. Customer takes a box of cereal off the front of the shelf. We're putting a box of cereal on the back of the shelf. If we can minimize the amount of inventory that we have in the system, I get a promotion." And then we went and talked to the plant manager and we asked the same question. What are your incentives like? How do you get a promotion? The plant manager said, "Oh, it's easy. Me and my team get paid based on the tonnage of cereal that we produce every quarter. So they get incentivized based on the volume of cereal. How much did this cereal weigh?" So imagine this, at the end of the quarter, you're the plant manager. Your plant makes multiple types of cereal. One of them happens to be rice that's sort of crisped and filled with a lot of air, and the other happens to be bran flakes that you load up with raisins. Which one are you going to make at the end of the quarter? You're always going to make that raisin bran because it's the heaviest one. And that's the thing that's going to guarantee your bonus. It might not be what customers are ordering. And so you might be working against that inventory manager. So the way to solve that is to really come together, take a step back and say, why are we even creating this software? We're creating this cereal in this case. We're creating the cereal so we can create a nutritious breakfast for our consumers. Let's focus on that and not these misaligned incentives that are pushing us to really fight against each other. And that also ends up with that finger pointing in the blame game.
I love that approach with just having people have a cup of coffee because the start of that is so simple, but it can lead to conversations like, wait, what are you doing? And like just understanding each other's roles, the jobs, the things they're working on, the opportunity to realize that they're trying to move in the same direction, but they aren't.
Absolutely. And it's also this other really interesting thing between manufacturing and software. In manufacturing, I can go and I can see the work in process, right? I can go and look at the line and see how things are going. In software, that's very difficult to do. Much of the work is invisible. So we have to make that work visible. Oftentimes, the way that we make that work visible is through conversations, through tracking systems where we're showing the work, maybe on a Kanban board or something like this. Again, thank you, lean manufacturing, for some of these lessons. But it's making that work visible and having those conversations that I think is so, so important.
Yeah, the similarities are extraordinary of how so
Yeah.
many manufacturing techniques get refined in the industry, then move into IT, and now we're in this industrial DevOps world that we're pushing forward. We created the report. Thank you again for the collaboration there. Um, it seems to be gaining traction. What are your thoughts? Have you had any conversations lately about this outside of ours?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly talked with some of the guests that you have coming up on this fireside chat series, Suzette and Robin. Really excited to tune into that. And I know that they wrote a book on industrial DevOps, and that's been getting a lot of traction. You mentioned a conference that you were at, and one that I was at recently was the Enterprise Tech Leadership Summit, and there was certainly lots of interest around the industrial DevOps happening there. So yeah, definitely seeing more traction happening there. And it is really interesting just to see these DevOps principles and practices applied in other disciplines outside of necessarily just software engineering.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. And it's so positive, like the response that I had yesterday. And especially for manufacturing, we have 2 million open jobs right now.
Mhm.
We have all these predictions by 2030 of being up to like 10 million plus open jobs. And the biggest thing is trying to attract people and make manufacturing appealing to that next generation. I talked to so many people under 30 yesterday that were like, I love your message about industrial DevOps. I love that you're doing this. We're super interested in our like company and product, but also just the idea because it delivers that ability to take control of your role, work in a community of people and unify, going back to Eli Goldratt's The Goal, towards the common goal. And it's so encouraging to see. Um, like, I love this stuff. I have a bunch more questions for you, but I want to take a quick pause. Joe, have we gotten any questions in that we can address?
Not, excuse me, not just yet, but it is a good reminder. We do want this to be collaborative. If there are any questions any of our attendees have, this is the opportunity to ask our panelists. And if any come in, I'll jump in and ask them as they come in. So feel free to continue to keep them coming. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Joe. All right. So Nathen, before we started, we were talking a little bit about your recent presentation, A Decade of DORA. And when we
Yes.
were prepping for this session, we also talked about lessons learned. I was wondering if you could tell us a little about that presentation and if it didn't have lessons learned, if you could unpack some lessons learned after that.
Oh, for sure, for sure. So that presentation is really about the history of our research program called DORA. The first lesson learned is that I'm pretty terrible at math. You see, the DevOps started around 2009. Here we are in 2024. Has it been a decade? It certainly has. It's been a little bit more than that. And the first research was actually launched around 2011. So clearly we're more than a decade. But the thing that I really wanted to get across with that presentation is that we do have more than a decade worth of research into how teams are getting better at delivering and operating software. That research, one of the things that it's most known for is the way that we measure software delivery performance. And the way that we measure software delivery performance with DORA, we use two high-level metrics, throughput and stability. So when we think about changing software, we want to think about how quickly are you able to make changes? And when you do make changes, how stable are those changes? We break each of those down into two additional metrics or two like concrete metrics. On the throughput side, we have deployment frequency and change lead time. So really we're asking the question there, how long does it take a change to go from, say, a developer's workstation into the production environment, whatever that production environment might be? And then how frequently are you updating the production environment? And on the stability side, we have, again, two metrics. The first is the change failure rate. I personally, I call this the O expletive rate. It's what happens when you push a change to production and someone shouts out an expletive. Perhaps it's you that shouts out that expletive. I don't know, but it means something went wrong and we need to fix it right now. So maybe we're rolling back that change or pushing forward a hot fix. And then the final one is what we call the failed deployment recovery time. So when I have pushed a bad change to production, how long does it take before the systems are back to working and our customers are happy again? Now, the interesting thing about these metrics that we've seen throughout the lifetime of the research is that speed and stability, we tend to think of them as trade-offs, right? You can either be fast or you can be stable. But the truth is, what we see again for more than a decade is that these two things tend to move together. The teams with the best software delivery performance have both high stability and high throughput, and the teams with the worst have low stability and low throughput. And the big lesson learned there really, and again, I think this comes from a lot of the lessons from manufacturing, is that if we're shipping smaller changes and continuously shipping smaller changes and getting fast feedback on those changes as we go, that's the thing that leads to the most success. So that's one thing. But the research itself looks at more than just those 4 metrics. It wants to really understand, how do you improve those 4 metrics? And for that, we look at people, culture, we look at process, we look at technology, and tools, things like this. And some of the real interesting findings there. One, we've found that software delivery performance matters. When you have better software delivery performance, you have better organizational performance, and at least as importantly, better well-being for the people on your team. Their higher job satisfaction, less burnout, things like that. Those are all really good outcomes that we want to strive for. But we also know that it's a complex process to get software delivered. And things like documentation are fundamental. Internal documentation has been shown to be sort of an amplifier of your team's ability to deliver software safely. As we mentioned earlier, culture sort of underpins all of this. It's so important that as a team, we're working collaboratively, we're learning as we go. We have a good climate for learning. We have good incentives that are well aligned, and those incentives require good leadership as well. So there's a lot to learn in this body of work. And then I kind of wrapped up the presentation with a look forward. What will the next decade with DORA mean for us? And certainly we're in this new era where AI is starting to take over and come into every place that we're looking at. So it's really interesting, and we've done a good bit of research this year into that. So stay tuned for the report. This year's report will be out mid-October, but we'll have a lot more insights into how AI is impacting the day-to-day lives of developers, and what sorts of impact is it having on software delivery performance, organizational performance, and so forth.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing all that. I have a couple questions to dig in there
Sure.
a little deeper and pull back into manufacturing. So I loved that point about fast and stable and being able to have fast feedback. And I hear a lot about fail fast all around tech. I feel like that's such a mantra, but it's not just fail, it's learn. And I like how you framed it with that fast feedback, because that's agile learning and figuring things out with speed and the batch size so that it's manageable.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we live in a world where the best success really comes from experimentation, and we want to start with a hypothesis. We think that by changing this, we're going to get this particular outcome. And then we have to go and test that hypothesis. And sometimes the hypothesis will be proven true. Sometimes it will be proven false. In a scientific world, either way, that's a successful experiment. We've just learned, right? Both that this thing, we've either learned that this thing isn't going to help or that it will help. But either way, that's a success. And so to have that mindset with the changes that we're making, and to bring that mindset to manufacturing, to bring that mindset to delivering and building software, that's really, really important.
Completely. That's why I'm like so on board with the mission of industrial DevOps to there's so many different pieces of it that I'd love to highlight, but thinking about the visibility that it gives everybody that's working on industrial code to work in one place, because there's so many proprietary and antiquated systems and layered over new systems. But to be able to pull that in and work as a team, you can figure out what's going on. Going back to your security point, you can have better security because you know what's connected and you know what's out of date, and you can update it in a timely and planned way as a team, like bringing the IT and OT convergence together, the IT and OT teams together. It just drives that culture and that mindset to empower people. I like that empowerment. Like, I couldn't say enough about that with both DevOps and industrial DevOps. Have you seen that in the research, that people feel more empowered and engaged both in their jobs and with their team?
Absolutely. We definitely see as you improve software delivery performance, we have higher job satisfaction. We're more engaged with the job. But the other thing that we found in 2023 was that those software engineers that are better connected to their users, getting good user feedback, getting good signals from their users on how well they're doing with their application. Those teams, again, had even higher job satisfaction. So it's not just about being able to ship software, but really staying connected to that mission. And the mission is, as we've discussed, like, how do we delight our users, whoever those users may be, right? And that's very context specific based on your organization, your role in the organization, and so forth. But I think there are also lots of other interesting techniques. Certainly from a software perspective, we try to have good test environments. And in a manufacturing environment, like, how do we build a digital twin of the actual physical line and be able to test and run scenarios to get that feedback in a way that's safe, where if something were to completely fail, we're not talking about the actual manufacturing line that just failed. It's the digital twin. And then we know, all right, well, this change isn't going to work successfully if we try to roll it out at scale in the real world, if you will. So having those sort of mirrors of twins, I think that can be a really powerful thing, which again goes back to lessons that we've learned from DevOps through automation and that both the joy and the perils of automation, and how more automation means you're going to spend more time on things like making sure that you're resilient and able to catch and respond to things when they go wrong.
Yeah, and if you can get that automation running smoothly, it frees up your people to do more value add, to do more analysis, to go back to the metrics and see what is working and reassess the way forward. So much so, like, you can't have any metrics if you don't have visibility into what you're doing.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And eliminating that, we have a term for it. We call it toil, right? The toil that people have to do. That's work that you have to do over and over again that has no lasting value, but you have to do it in order to keep things running. How do we eliminate or automate away that toil so that we, the humans, right, can use our big brains to solve more interesting problems and drive more value out of these systems?
If one of the most interesting data points that came out of our survey was that 4 hours a month are spent on code review, 45 hours a month are spent on debugging. And it just makes me think about that person or those teams having to toil, having to rework things that were already done, and what kind of impact that has on them. Whereas, as we talk about the impact of a functional DevOps, industrial DevOps process, it really drives community. It makes me think about being part of a community.
Absolutely. And in technology, code reviews and debugging, they're ever present. That's always happening. But one of the ways that we find that you can improve the outcomes from both of those is through a practice called pair programming. And there's always pushback to pair programming. You mean I'm going to dedicate 2 engineers to solving one problem instead of 1 engineer each to solving 2 problems? But the research is there, and we see time and time again, but not only through research, but also through lived experience, that pairing actually allows you to build things safer and faster. And think about the knowledge sharing that happens when it's 2 engineers working on a thing. So we're already eliminating that single point of failure by having 2 engineers work on this. And you've probably come to a hairy problem in your life before. And if you talk it out with someone else, sometimes that someone else might be a rubber duck even, but just talking out that problem, you get to a better solution. And so pair programming is one of the ways that you can help eliminate the need for code reviews. You're reviewing it real time, probably speed up your debugging. You've got 2 brains working on this problem instead of 1. And the net effect over the long term is definitely positive.
So you just made me think of 2 books. So one, reading right now, How to Change by a University of Pennsylvania professor. And it talks about the power of pairing people. And she speaks more specifically about a larger group and having the like A players, B players, C players, and the B players kind of stemming the gap, connecting and being for the benefit of all so that they can drive in a better direction. And this book, The Powers of Two, which digs into, have you heard of The Power of Two?
I haven't heard of that one, no.
Oh, such a good one. So it digs into founders of a whole bunch of organizations that we all know. And it talks about the two founders and how, just like you just talked through the benefits of having two people, being able to have one person with one skill set, one with another, or just like a different perspective to say, hey, that might not work. Let's try it. And then here's how we're going to iterate. Just to be able to bounce those ideas, like the whole approach as we're moving through technology adoption, which can be really disorienting, especially in these older brownfield manufacturing facilities.
Hmm.
If you can team people, that drives accountability and it drives community and gives them a common goal to work towards. Like, I love that idea.
Absolutely. And you can explode that even further if we go back to like all of the failures and downtime that we have in manufacturing as we have, learning reviews or retrospectives or postmortems, whatever you call them, inviting more people into those conversations gives you better perspectives, more diverse perspectives. And again, that's been shown time and time again to lead to better outcomes. We can have more learnings, lessons to take away from those outages or those incidents.
Yeah, and you're making me think about cybersecurity again there. So in the survey, we saw that 41% of chief security officers were involved in decision making for OT, which honestly, from what I've seen the last couple of years in my research, has increased. So a big positive there, and something that we want to see continue more. And it also makes me think of the Phoenix Project, where they talk about John being left out, and he's the CISO at that organization. And once they involve him, they've realized the most effective path to security is working together so that everybody can identify what's really impacting the organization from a security perspective.
Yeah, that resonates really well. I think that it's often that when we separate from each other and kind of work in our own way, we tend to imagine what's happening over there. And what we imagine is happening over there is usually pretty far disconnected from reality. And that happens both ways. And we end up just, othering each other and getting angry with each other for maybe not following the policies that I wrote. And likewise, for writing ridiculous policies that are impractical. Like, so we have to come together, and it's through that collaboration. And again, thinking back to, we've said this, I don't know, 100 times already today, that common goal that we're working towards and really aligning on that is so, so important.
Totally agree. And before you mentioned AI, and I wasn't
Yes.
avoiding that, but I wanted to come back to it. So I've been at the conference I was at yesterday, another conference like 2 weeks ago, and every conference I've been to in the last couple of years. AI, such a huge topic. And coming from my industrial DevOps perspective,
Hmm.
and having worked a lot on architecture, like architecture slides and so many different things over the last couple of years, I just think about that old phrase of garbage in, garbage out. And I see industrial DevOps where it is connected to the machines. And when you start thinking about AI, how are you going to maximize your use of AI? I think setting the right foundation. And industrial DevOps starts at that machine layer,
Hmm.
connecting to the machines, making sure the code is right, understanding who's changing the code, when they're changing the code, why they're changing the code, who has access to the code, so that you set the proper baseline to build up to the data that's going to feed your AI models. Have, for the DevOps approach and in your experience, does that resonate?
It does resonate, and I think the interesting thing about AI right now is sort of the horses out of the barn. Like AI is here,
Mhm.
it's here to stay, and it behooves all of us to continue to experiment with AI and learn what are the best ways that we can use it and start to understand some of the implications. Like you said, garbage in, garbage out. That's not true only of AI. That's been true for every system that we've
Everything.
built basically forever. But it gets amplified with AI, right? And so it does mean also that, some of that time that you talked about doing code reviews, perhaps as software engineers, more of our time is going to be spent doing code reviews, but we're going to be reviewing code that was written by a machine, not necessarily by a fellow human, or code that was collaborated on between human and machine. But seeing how AI is unlocking so much productivity and creating great experiences for our customer and just fundamentally changing things. I don't know. When I'm driving down the highway, my car is way smarter based on AI and the things that it can know as I'm driving down the highway than it was when even 5 years ago. So it's really incredible to see those advances. Of course, there are safety and security implications that go along with that we all as a society need to be very careful of and cognizant of. But the truth is, the AI is here, it's here to stay, and it's going to fundamentally change the way that we do a lot of things in our day-to-day lives.
Couldn't agree more. And using responsibly, I just see it as
Absolutely.
such a great way to amplify the human impact
Yep.
and be able to up level what you're doing. Like with manufacturing, distribution, especially, we're looking for ways dealing with the skills gap and a labor shortage to automate where appropriate and put people into roles where they can oversee more, feel more self-worth in what they're doing, and be learning as they're going so that they're not doing that old, dank, dirty, dark, dangerous manufacturing of old. And I'm definitely seeing that change. I feel so much optimism for that. And I know we're coming near the end. Before I ask this next question, are there any questions we can address from the audience?
Yeah, there was one that was on culture, excuse me, and it was asking about how can team members or individual contributors sort of be catalyst for change up, not necessarily change coming from the top down.
Thanks, Joe. Nathan, you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really interesting question because, depending on the organization that you're working in, sometimes collaboration at the individual contributor level is discouraged. So if you want to help change that culture from the ground up, sometimes you have to bend the rules a little bit. If that collaboration across teams is discouraged, maybe you go find someone on the other team who wants to collaborate and is also feeling discouraged. They can't stop you from getting coffee. So that's certainly one way that you can start. And then I think the other thing that really matters is if you want to change the culture and you want to push culture change up, you have to understand the language and the things that matter, the KPIs, the measurements that the people above you are using. And so I think going to coffee with a leader and maybe even a leader from another team to understand how are they thinking about the business? How are they thinking about how teams work? And then you yourself probably will have to translate the work that you do into the things that they care about through that conversation and through future conversations. So I think that it is really important that you take on that because in the long run, it's going to have tremendous value both to you and your teammates, but also to the organization as a whole.
Yeah, I love that perspective. But just taking it on yourself to go and have these conversations. Don't be afraid to talk to leaders, figure out what's important to them. I know I reference a lot of books whenever I talk, but the culture map had a great point in it talking about how this one organization in Japan made decisions. And it started at the ground up. And you would meet with a colleague, you would say, I have this idea, work together, get common ground, and then you would move up in a pyramid throughout the organization, connecting with different people, building that momentum of organizational change together and stakeholder buy-in. I think it would be good to mix in what the priorities of the leaders are. So also talk to them so that as this moves up, you're kind of moving two directions to bring it together and make that change.
Yeah, that's really cool. I guess the other thing about understanding your leaders and having conversations with them is you might discover the things that they don't care about. And these might be things that you were hesitant to change for fear of the consequences. By understanding what your leader cares about, you might understand that, maybe we don't even need to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. Maybe they don't even care how this particular thing gets done. And that autonomy is left to me. So I'm empowered to change that and do the thing the right way. So I think there's a little bit of that in there as well.
Totally. You never know unless you ask.
That's
Try
right.
and get that understanding.
Yep.
I love that. All right. So we're rounding towards the end. We talked a little bit about the future, and I wanted to ask you what you see for the future of DORA, for the future of DevOps, and the future of industrial DevOps. And feel free to speak in general terms, or if you're thinking 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years.
Sure. So with DORA, I think that I mentioned we'll publish our report in about a month's time, and I want to thank Copia for being a sponsor of the research this year and a sponsor for that report. That's super helpful.
Very excited for it.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing that we've done over the past couple of years, we've launched the DORA community. You can get to it at dora.community. And this is a place where all of us come together as practitioners, as researchers, as leaders to understand what can we learn from this research and how can we put it to practice within our own teams. And so I'm kind of excited about this idea of what can we learn from industrial and software, and how do we blend those two things together? So hopefully some of the folks that are tuning into today's webinar will join our conversation there at dora.community. And then I think over the long term, I think fundamentally some things aren't going to change. As an organization, as a team, we need a climate for learning. We need fast feedback mechanisms. We need ways to keep the individuals, the employees, in the flow of work. And I guess the flow of work could be said also about the manufacturing of goods. We want to keep those in the flow. That said, the techniques and the challenges and the tools that we're going to use are going to continually be changing. And so I think building that foundational experimental approach, write down a hypothesis, change a thing, validate or invalidate that hypothesis, rinse and repeat. We're on a journey of continuous learning and continuous improvement, which is why DORA's tagline is "Get better at getting better." It's really all about this idea of continuous improvement. And DevOps has always had a long history of learning from other industries. And so continuing to share that knowledge and those insights and lessons learned back and forth across these different industries, these different professions, I think is super important. And I certainly hope that continues for a long time.
Well, I appreciate that so much, Nathan. I've really appreciated our collaboration because I completely agree. There's so much to learn across the IT, manufacturing, OT space. As we've gone through in this history conversation today, and so much more in the future. And I'd like to see more of that parallel learning. Then we go a couple decades.
Yes.
One industry goes up, the other one kind of slows down. I think in this speed of technology adoption right now, and the knowledge that's out there, everything that we talked about today, we can do this parallel learning path and really just amplify the impact for everybody, which is to the benefit of all of the teams and everybody working in these spaces, and will help uncloud that fear of technology adoption, that fear of what's happening with my role, the fear of change, and move towards embrace it so that you can get better at getting better.
Absolutely. I love it.
Me too. All right. So that's all the questions I have for you. If we have any questions from the audience, now is your time. Please feel free to ask anything. Happy to answer any questions, and then we can just close out after that. Any last questions, Joe?
Yeah, I don't think we're seeing any, but would it be okay to say that if any questions do come up, feel free to reach out after as well to get those answered?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Joe. And Nathan, do you have any last thoughts to end on?
I just want to thank you for having me on. This has been a really fun conversation, and I hope everyone has a chance to read the first annual State of Industrial DevOps report, and then we'll all get excited about the second annual State of Industrial DevOps report. And yeah, I hope to see you all in the DORA community and out there online, and taking some of these lessons and putting them into practice on your own team.
Thank you. I've already got a meeting set up with Suzette to talk through the second annual. So we're getting
Awesome.
started on that. I want to reiterate, everybody join the DORA community. If you're interested, you should definitely join. I'm in it. I love it. And I'm super excited for the next report coming out in mid-October. Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome.
Thank you again, Nathan. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.